When I hear the word burnout, I think I hear a realization that you're numb to even being able to try to do anything else. There's no sense of feeling. Like burnout to me is not like I'm so tired I can't do anything. Burnout to me is I can't even care enough to try a new way.
Meet Kimberly McGlonn, founder of Blvd. Discover why the future of business isn't just about profit, it's about people, purpose, and building systems that create lasting impact. Welcome to the Purpose Profit Shift, where real stories about bold shifts illuminate how we can create a new economy. I'm your host, Rachel Bernier-Green, social entrepreneur, activist, and founder of Thrivo Financial Advisory, a finance consulting firm designed to help purposeful businesses change the world. This episode is brought to you by Thrivo Financial Advisory, where mission-driven founders go when they're ready to stop choosing between profit and purpose. We work with progressive business owners to build financial systems that fund the impact you actually want to make. Cash flow clarity, profit-first structure, and a CFO in your corner who gets why you started this in the first place. Learn more at jointhrivo.com. That's JOINTHRYVO.com. My guest today is Dr. Kimberly McGlonn, founder and principal advisor of Blvd, author, social entrepreneur, and the founder of Grant Blvd, which was North America's first Black-owned B Corp in fashion. She spent more than 2 decades at the intersection of education, sustainable design, and social justice, was funded by Beyoncé, recognized by Inc. and Visa, and named one of the 150 most influential Philadelphians. Her work asks one big question: what if leadership actually served the common good? Dr. Kimberly, welcome to the Purpose Profit Shift.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I love it. Starting off with song. And also, before we start, I'm in love with this picture behind you. Is there a story behind this gorgeous piece of art?
It is. This is called Forbidden Fruit. She's by a Philadelphia-based visual artist, Allegra Young Foxblood, and this is her self-portrait. And I acquired this piece in 2020, so it's been with me for a little while now. And for people who know her work, she usually paints a lot of pop cultures. This is her first time. I mean, it's a massive painting, tackling herself and temptation, the nature of temptation, with a little bit of biblical glazing. And I walk into my house and I'm always welcomed by it. So I'm happy to share with you all. That's Forbidden Fruit.
Yes, because I just could not jump into it and ignore the background behind you, because I was in awe from the moment you jumped on the call.
Yeah, I love this piece.
Yes. So let's jump into it. For everyone listening, I have had the pleasure of getting to know your work from reading your book, working through one of your workbooks, and hearing you speak at the B Corp Champions Retreat. And one of the things that you talk about in your book is describing your life as having really 2 childhoods and being a part of 2 different Americas, that there was that middle-class stability on Grant Blvd, and then there was a moment when everything changed. Can you talk to us a little bit about the through line from being that little girl to the leader you are today and how that actually started?
Yeah, I think that in each of our lives, there are either things that happen within our families or exposures that we have outside of our families that permanently shape the way that we see the world, and by extension, permanently alter the way that we see ourselves. And I think that there were definitely a few pivotal experiences in my girlhood on that house at 2677 North Grant Boulevard that determined how I would think about not just like who I would be in the world, but how I would serve the world. And so, I go back to that house and I think about what I learned when my dad was present, and then what I learned when my dad was absent. And I think the same is true of my mom, what I learned in her presence and what I learned in her absence. And all of the people who, kind of floated in and out of that early era moment of my life that or who I should say, each gave me a different way of understanding what it means to be American, and that we don't have one singular relationship even with that noun.
Yeah, that is so true. And I think that that shows up in your perspective in a lot of ways. And one of the things that fascinated me as I was getting to know your story is that you were actually an English teacher for 2 decades before entrepreneurship called your name. So, what was the moment that you realized that teaching in the system wasn't enough, that you needed to build something differently?
Well, I think I want to first, kind of acknowledge all of the roles that teachers play in the lives of children globally. Teachers
Yes,
are therapists and nurses and social workers and are cheerleaders
absolutely.
and are like, these really powerful guides to how we make sense of the world that we inherit. And I loved being that for those two decades. I started out in middle school. I taught middle school English for 2 years, and then I moved into high school English for 18 years. And I was teaching in a suburb of a large city, so what we would call an urban planning and inner ring suburb. So, a community adjacent to a major city, Philadelphia in this case. And it was a bedroom community of mostly, almost entirely white Americans who were, to some extent, were trying to insulate themselves from urban life by being able to forge an upper middle class community for themselves. And so I taught there. I was the only person of color on faculty for the majority of those years. And my students were, by extension, mostly
Oh,
white.
wow.
Yeah. And so I taught a course in colonialism. So getting them to understand the world that they would be likely to travel through because of their privilege, and trying to help them to understand the choices, the intentional planning that has shaped the world that we all live in now. And then I taught another class in American literature, which was like, what does it mean to have an experience of America outside of the notion of the dream, right? Or in pursuit of this notion of a dream, when it's not your life, but it's something that you long for, mostly because of marketing, because of Hollywood. And so I did that, and I decided, yeah. And so, but I decided about year 15 that I wanted to just, I don't know, I wanted to see what else was possible. So I decided to take a sabbatical, and I left, and I did a little bit of traveling around the world. I spent probably the most important time I spent was in Nairobi, Kenya. And there were some experiences that I had in Nairobi as a woman, Black woman, by myself in East Africa, that made me observe, I think, systems and systems design in a way that I didn't as a teacher in the classroom. Like, teaching about the world is one thing, but being in a colonized place alone was a totally different thing. And I came back from that and like all those learnings, right? Rachel, I had spent time with women who were HIV positive and had been kicked out from their families and were trying to figure out how to take care of themselves and build, self-sustaining economies. And then with some elephant populations that were really struggling with human encroachment on their habitat. So I brought all that back to the States, and all of that like possibility and response sat right at the same time that I watched for the first time Ava DuVernay's documentary 13, which was like a really deep dive into the deepest roots of America, which is how did,
Right.
400 years of American slavery create another economic model for shoring up the middle class, particularly if you are white and you live in a town that runs off of prisons. And what does that mean for all of the people who get caught up in this system of incarceration, in part because there are shareholders and sheriffs and, and bail bondsmen who are all benefiting from this system. So I came back and I decided I needed to be in different proximity. So I took that teaching experience and I said, you know what, I think I want to solve for some social design challenges through business. And I didn't know anything really about business. I observed my parents try to run a delicatessen when I was a girl, but I certainly didn't have an MBA, but it didn't stop me from, shooting my shot, as the kids say, and trying to figure out how to build a brand.
I love that because it illustrates that really any of us can have the entrepreneurial bug bite us. And I love when people come to entrepreneurship as a means to an end, when they have seen a problem that they're trying to solve and are using entrepreneurship as the tool to do so. because I think that calling is so different than what leads a lot of people, I think, into entrepreneurship.
I couldn't agree more.
Now, you named your first company after the street that you grew up on. Can you talk a little bit about why you did that instead of going with maybe a more neutral brand name?
I was I filed that LLC. You know, we think about what does it mean to start something and to be scrappy and, leverage your networks to build a thing when you don't have necessarily the, perhaps other forms of traditional capital to get things off the ground. For me and Grant Boulevard, there was like a chapter that I don't write about in Build Boldly, but was a part of my life. I chose the sabbatical, but before I chose the sabbatical, I actually considered going to law school. And so I knew that the classroom was only one way of serving the common good. So I applied to law school, did the whole LSAT thing, and got into law schools. And one of the first open admitted students weekends I went to, I met a guy from Philly, and he became my law school friend. And he decided to go to law school, and I didn't. But when I decided to launch Grant Boulevard, I reached out to him. I tapped every corner of my social network, and I just said, Antonio, can you please help me file this LLC? And so we sat down at my little kitchen table and we were going through names, and he was like, K-Mac, that's his nickname for me, K-Mac. You gotta name it Grant Boulevard. You gotta make it personal. You gotta make it, this should feel like you are making it clear to people that this is personal. And this work, this idea is personal for you. And so that's kind of where it came from. And then it wasn't until after I named it that I realized that it would force me to really confront the challenges of my childhood and having to tell that story of Grant Boulevard and trying to figure out how to reconcile with my parents. It brought up all these other opportunities. And so, it was a very personal thing.
I love that in that it, because I knew the name, it carried so much weight. But I love to hear how it played a role in your story and kind of how it came about. So one of the core parts of your manufacturing model was hiring people who were formerly incarcerated, so hiring reentering citizens, and the vast majority of them were mothers. And that was one of the things that really stood out in your story, because in my previous business, we focused on hired reentering citizens, and it was some of the most transformational and challenging work that I did in my life. So what were some of those things that you learned during that first year of business that even if you had gone to business school, no business school could have taught you that?
I don't think that any business school, I think at the macro level, on the macro level, business schools are so intent on a model that is extractive that I would have been ill prepared to pioneer an approach that was actually interested in a web of like mutual concern, of like just like a larger concern. So I don't think that, I think had I gone to a traditional business school, I probably would have been less likely to even try the approach that I pioneered for almost that decade. And I think that in addition to that, the challenges that it could not have prepared me for was like, how do you support an employee who needs to be in contact with probation and parole? How do you get flexible about making sure that they can navigate that? How do you support a mother who is in some ways inheriting her children back from someone else who's been taking care of them and trying to build a new relationship while she has to navigate an existing parental bond that was built in her absence? I don't think that business school could have taught me about the lack of consumer education around businesses that are priced to meet the common good. Like we oftentimes have to, we end up being what is sometimes a premium good because of the way we're thinking about cost of goods in general. And what do you do when your consumer hasn't been conditioned to expect that or to demand that or even to properly value that? And so those are some of the challenges, I think, in coming at it as an outsider, for sure.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you raised the point that there is this level of consumer awareness and versus what we have been conditioned to. And people don't realize that when we are conditioned to, purchasing very low cost goods, that we are also, as a result, part of a system that is extracting from someone to give us those low cost goods. And so many of us think, well, we want to do something different. We want to be a part of the change, but don't think about what that means for our personal bottom lines and what we need to be able to invest to make that happen. And how did you go about it as you were like teaching people?
I think that for me, in teaching people, it was about, we ran 2 brick and mortar stores, and it was having signage up that broke down our costing model. So trying to get to some consumer education through just pricing transparency. This is the cost of goods. This is the living wage that we pay. Just trying to make it plain for people was one way. And then a lot of just like our labels were specific about like, how do we leverage a QR code to tell a water brand story? How do we, be ethical about our storytelling so that people understand our why? It was layers of intentional design around just like making it plain.
Yes. I love that. There's so much power in transparency. And another thing that that is coming to mind as you're talking about this and how you communicated the story is that you also talked about how you have a radical love story for people and the planet. And that I imagine that's part of what you were communicating, with some of these QR codes and things of that nature. So can you tell us about what radical love looked like on a Tuesday at Grant Boulevard?
Yeah, I think we should probably dive into like, what does this notion of radical care even mean? And I think that for me, radical care is about recognizing that the space that separates our needs from the needs of a stranger is much, much smaller and shorter than we imagine. And that the needs of a stranger are my needs, like their wellness, their joy, their suffering it's relational to my own joy. And even now, where I've been observing in the news, all of this, some of this climate science, and I'm particularly right now aware of what's happening in India in the summer months where the temperatures are just, they're so high. They're 118. I think yesterday was a Fahrenheit of 118 degrees. And I sat in my car today, and for a moment before my own air conditioning kicked in, I thought about them. I considered like, wow, it's 99 degrees here and I'm sweltering. And my heart sent out a prayer for the people of India, hundreds of millions of people who are suffering under sweltering heat. That sense of like awareness that sits with us and just the natural flow of our day, that to me is a part of the spirit of radical care. And I think that it's something that we as entrepreneurs can bake into the cake of our approach that makes our businesses stronger and perhaps in a more radical sense, more viable, but they also align our work as entrepreneurs with a longer history of activism and really sincere social concern.
Yes, absolutely. I think that is so true. We have, I think, particularly in America, because our culture is so individualistic, that we tend to forget those broader connections that we have to the greater community. And I'd love to switch gears for a moment because something that I have really wanted to ask you, because I know what it looks like to have the accolades coming and everyone has this perception of how things are going versus the lived experience of being a social entrepreneur. And so as you were building Grant Boulevard, you were funded by Beyonce's BeyGood Foundation, and Visa named you She's Next. And what is the part of being celebrated that the audience doesn't see? Because I think it's so important for us when we're painting a true picture of entrepreneurship to say, yes, that felt great, but also this is what I was feeling, holding at the same time.
Yeah, I think that we probably, because we're such a fake it as you make it culture, we don't talk about, we're just so conditioned to not, and then when we do share what's quote unquote real, even that I feel like sometimes gets sensationalized for the sake of like pity or attention or spectacle. So it's quite a line to figure out how to be honest while not being not exploiting the challenges for attention in an attention economy. But I say all that to say, one of the things that was probably hardest for me was just the loneliness of trying to do things in a way that was antithetical to business as usual for everyone else. So it was so lonely to just realize like I felt sometimes I was pushing a mountain up a hill of gravel in high heel shoes because there were so many considerations and it was so hard to find footing and hold footing and produce momentum and, make more momentum and raising money in an economy and in a social culture that in one way doesn't bet on women as entrepreneurs, in another way doesn't see Black women in terms of the real value that we create. And then in the third way, doesn't have its priorities straight around the urgency of the moment.
Oh, that resonates so deeply. And you have also, been honest about burnout, which I think because of the extra weight that women and particularly women of color carry when they are entrepreneurs, especially when they're entrepreneurs who are charting new territory and trying to intentionally veer away from the status quo, that contributes to the levels of burnout that we, experience. So what was the moment that you knew that what you were leading was no longer sustainable? And what did you do with that information when that thought kind of occurred to you?
When I hear the word burnout, I think I hear a realization that you're numb to even being able to try to do anything else. Like there's no sense of feeling. Like burnout to me is not like I'm so tired I can't do anything. Burnout to me is I can't even care enough to try a new way. And I say that to say that I don't think that I really fully experienced burnout. I think that and I write about this in the newer work, the leaders work, that I've always committed myself to doing a lot of practices related to solitude and silence and stillness. And they've always sturdied me, even in the storming of a brand that I knew had potential, but didn't have marketing dollars. We were spending so much money on wages that as a small company, it was really hard to compete with larger, particularly in fashion, brands that, because they don't pay their workers anything, all they really produced were stories.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think for me, it came down to the team, us all thinking through how do I pay you more? And that became, well, that means we have to change our pricing structure. And so we ran I tried to figure out what's the strategy on that. And it was like, well, if we move into a luxury story, we can maybe raise prices and people will be comfortable. People who like luxury will be comfortable paying it. And the reality is that the culture of the country just changed. The temperature in 2024, it just swung the entire other way, away from progressive pursuits. And it made it that much harder to raise money. And so that was where we reached the cliff edge. We did a reposition, we did a rebrand, and it was all aligned with the story I knew needed to be told about how do we wear garments inside that honor our lives with more dignity than what we present to the public even. And the pendulum just swung the absolute other way in terms of just like, I mean, I hate to say it, just like extraction and speed and abuse and disregard. And that made a product like ours and which an ecosystem and an ecosystem like ours much less appealing to the general consumer who was actually struggling with burnout.
Man, what a way to bring that home. And yes, having been there and walked that path, it was actually, I have cried before on the podcast, did not expect to tear up in that moment. But yeah, you just brought home a lot of the things that, to your earlier point about the loneliness that can come when you are a woman entrepreneur in this space, that things that I did not have a way to give voice to as I was experiencing them, and recognizing, holding in one hand that you have built something of quality, of something that is worth existing, and that also because of the systemic forces that you are up against, that in this current moment, it may not be able to sustain itself. And that is a hard reality to, juxtapose those two things that are both true and hold space for them at the same time and be able to make decisions about what you're going to do next at that time.
Yeah. And recently I was in Denver last week, and my business partner, she's also my manager, she said to me, Kimberly, you've always been ahead. And I thought to myself, that's also been, I think, in some ways, if you look particularly in the spaces of art and culture, and even in business, Madam C.J. Walker, Maggie Walker in Richmond, Black women have always been ideating to solve a present problem with a future vision for what was possible, and have always been under capitalized to move with the same sense of speed that people who are designing things for destruction are able to get access to. And that is something that we have to find some way in our spirits of reconciling, what it means to be, such a creative force for good in a global economy designed to actually fund death and destruction.
Right.
That's so real.
And, it is. And I think that I hope by giving voice to it, that people that are listening in that space can, one, if they're there, know that they're not alone, and that, that this is it's not a personal failing, that they still showed up and did something good and impactful in the world. And also, it can be true that the world wasn't ready at that specific time.
Yeah, what you just said about, in my fun time, I write an advice column here in Philadelphia for a magazine, for the Philadelphia magazine called Dear Kimberly. And I recently, this week, we published an article. Someone wrote in about, they wanted to start a business and they were really afraid of public failure and, not being good enough and not taking off and everybody watching it. And it was so interesting to just reflect on, having built a very public brand, having to also very publicly acknowledge that I'd taken it as far as I could take it, and to disassociate myself from the end of that project with somehow that sense of personal failure, and that recognizing too that the things that we build, they're not us. They're expressions of us. They are experiments that we are driving, but they are not inherently who we are as people. And I want people who are listening and challenging themselves to build bold things to remember that.
Yeah. I talk to people about that all the time, because the soul searching that I had to do, because I had tied my identity so closely to what I built, that I had to let go of that, but also learn to build differently in the future, so that I did not build with the idea that I am the same thing and that my value is tied to the success of this entity, because that was never true, but it was a story that I told myself for a long time. And I think a lot of founders fall into that trap.
Yeah. I mean, it's ultimately every time you pitch it, every time you ask for money, every time you apply for a loan, your name is on it.
Mm-hmm.
So it becomes hard to not remember that the thing that you're actually, raising money for, that you want support around, it is you and it's not you. Yeah.
And now a moment ago, I almost laughed because you said in your downtime. And I think that your downtime may look differently than other people's downtime, because if my timelines were correct, as I was researching things, you were operating Grant Blvd, leading social impact at Fiddler Club, teaching at Drexel, sitting on Jenkintown's council. As you were writing Build It Boldly, is that correct?
I had resigned.
Oh, okay. Well, so then one thing down.
Yeah. I had resigned from that. I gave up when I came onto teaching faculty at Drexel, and then I just decided, like, okay, I'm going to move my life from the suburbs into the city, and that was something that I shed to make that move, and to make my life a little easier for sure. Yeah, but it's true. I've always, and I'm writing about that. I'm working on another. I mean, this is just. I'm a creative. I'm a teacher, and I really, really, I think I wish people understood this more about me. I really have very high regard for the opportunity to be alive and to be healthy, and so
Yes.
when I
Hmm.
think about that, I remember that I'm not always going to be healthy. I'm not going to always have this much energy. I'm not going to always have this much control over my time. And so, because those are things that I appreciate, I really try to just be really intentional. And the other reality is that, people, I think they look at my portfolio of projects and they think, wow, she's doing all these different things. But in my own conception, I'm a teacher. I just teach I have different
Hmm.
classes that I'm running simultaneously. And as a classroom teacher for 20 years, that's what I always did. I had 50 kids in this one section
Yes.
and 50 kids in that section. And then I had my afternoon class with 20, and they changed out every semester. So I think that teachers, I just want to shout out to all teachers one more time. Teaching for 20 years actually was like the Olympic training ground for being an Olympian in the design of life.
Hmm. Yes.
Yeah. I'm right now, I'm thinking a lot about this idea of all of us having many identities. We have a multiplicity of identities, and the ways in which we embrace them, the ways in which we develop them, the ways in which we talk about them, it determines how much we're actually able to achieve simultaneously. It's not the titles, it's not the pay, it's the task commitment
Yes.
to developing an identity with fidelity, right? So I take my identity as a mother very seriously.
Hmm.
I'm a highly engaged mother of one kid. That's one identity. And then, I write in the morning, or when my write, like I do that sometimes too. So yeah. So I'm having a lot of fun. I'm having a lot of fun just being able to like choose things, Rachel, and then step away from things.
I love that. And also so glad to hear that you're continuing to write because that was when I finished Build It Boldly. That was one of my first thoughts was, I hope Dr. McGlonn has another book in her because I felt like there was that I just like loved it so much that I was like, I hope that this is not the last time that I have the experience of picking up a new book from you and reading your
Mm.
experiences and your take on the world and seeing the things that we had in common and also the differences and everything that I can learn from both. So that just made my day because I hate, I never want to put somebody on the spot like, you just did this really big thing and it's amazing, but are you doing it again? Like people do when someone has a baby.
Yeah, that part. Or like Lauren Hill all this time later.
Yes. Yes.
Oh yeah, no, there's more writing. I think right now, I'm really enjoying this biweekly column. I've talked about, people have written in about processing shame and when to know when it's time to let go, and how to work on estranged relationships within your family dynamics. So I'm enjoying just being
Yeah.
vulnerable about how I've learned about all of those things. And then the new work is
Hmm.
about, it goes back to my PhD, so it's more focused on identity construction. And I think that I get a lot of, the way I've chosen to design my life, always having, holding with a lot of grace and attention and intention, intentionality, multiple identities. I'm looking forward to writing to women in general about how we can do that, how we can be the monk and the warrior and the lover and the heartbroken, how we
Yes.
can be the person who is ashamed, all in one life.
That means so much to me. And I know to so many women listening who hold multiple identities and sometimes wonder, is it possible to flourish while holding all of them? And it absolutely is. But there are so many stories that we tell ourselves that, make us think that we have to choose one or get pigeonholed somewhere.
Or just be small, just wilt and be small, and to
Yes.
try to be unseen, and I think that there's a way
Hmm.
of wanting to be visible with not wanting to take up all the space and eat up all the light and eat up all the energy, so I do think it is a journey of discovering balance and grace.
Yes. And kind of on that note, because this reminds me of one of the things that you talk about in your book, you say that business design starts with a clear statement of values, and then you list transparency, consistency, truthfulness, and a culture of care. Can you talk about why those four specifically, and also kind of what gets sacrificed when founders are skipping that step?
Oh, good question, Rachel. I think that all of those four kind of central concerns boil down to the cultivation, preservation of trust. And when you don't have trust, then your employees don't stay, your consumers aren't loyal,
Yeah.
the media doesn't believe you.
Yep.
So those things, those four things, how do you think about transparency? How do you think about care? Those are really about trust. And progress, I've learned, moves at the speed of trust. So really it's about how are you fostering and protecting things that establish trust.
Yes. I love that answer because it seems like it should be fundamental, but people do skip all of the above. And when we talk about business and leadership, trust is not a topic that, is at the center of a lot of people's focus.
That's right. They don't think about that. They don't think about it at all.
Yeah. And this is one of the reasons why I enjoy being in spaces like the Champions Retreat, where you are surrounded by, people that are running B Corps or other mission-driven organizations. And these are the kind of conversations that we're having. And instead of people, looking at you sideways, they're just saying, yes, absolutely, we need to cultivate trust. This is how I'm, being intentional in that area and how I'm learning to do better. It's just very refreshing sometimes.
Agreed. It's refreshing. And I think, it creates a sense of optimism that we're not alone in our such an intense effort to try to right size this economy.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you brought up optimism because one of the things that shows up kind of throughout your work is pragmatic optimism. And I would love it if you could talk a little bit about how that's different from the toxic positivity that a lot of people pour down founders' throat, because in my mind, it's healthier. Like, I hate to see toxic positivity coming because I don't need anyone to just tell me everything is sunshine and rainbows when I'm reading the news and I know it's not.
No. And I think that for me, that, reading the news, which I so agree with you, it produces so many negative emotions. But I think even reading the news or listening to the news, oftentimes it denies us the thing that we really need, which is context, which is history. And so I think for me, pragmatic optimism is recognizing that we live in a world rooted in things that have existed for a very long time. And we can go back to the whole arc of human history. And then we can look at the last 250 years of America. And both of them give us very different and valuable lens for recognizing that change has happened and change is possible, but it exists within the context of an inheritance that we cannot control. And that inheritance shapes the appetite that people have and even their own thinking about what's possible. And so that's why I think that, being pragmatic allows for us to actually recognize where we're making wins. Because if we only land in like the la position of optimism, we will, I think, oftentimes find ourselves very disappointed and defeated, So I think that pragmatism is an important and a mature approach to future planning.
Oh, absolutely. And this is bringing me back to something that you were saying earlier when you were talking about fundraising and how fundraising patterns shifted from the earlier days of Grant Blvd towards where they were toward the end. And you talked about some of your kind of reflections on fundraising in Build It Boldly. So what are some of the things that you tell purpose-driven founders about raising capital?
I tell them that you're going to have to try many things at once. You know, that idea of like, don't put all of your eggs in one basket is important. That there's like, how do you reach for the small pools and budget for that? The small gains with an intentional spend for the capital that you get. And how do you still simultaneously always carry around a grand plan for what would actually get you to the point of being really fully effectively capitalized? So I think it's about toggling with the possibility that you have like a deck of funding needs, and that depending on the audience, you can go high, you can go mid, you can go, low and approachable for an investor who's interested. I think I tell them to also, really think about the streams as with a lot of, awareness that it's not going to necessarily be a VC that gets involved, but that you might get a CFDI in your city that is interested in giving you a low interest loan, or a grant opportunity from a foundation, or a sponsorship thing that you could work out from a corporation. So, funders in this space, us in this community, we have to be really creative about recognizing where money lives, where we live, and then figuring out how to not push ourselves into one pot of where money is, and instead be really open and agile to finding it in a diversity of places.
Yes. And that was one of the things that I really loved in your book, because I have not seen that in a lot of books where people give a realistic perspective of what it looks like for a, small Black women-owned business to access capital in a variety of ways. And that is the reality, that it's, just looking at the data, it's usually not a VC that is the answer to our problems. And a VC could bring, depending on what your vision is for your company, more problems than you are counting on attached to that money. And so really being open to the idea that there may be a wealth of resources out there, but they might look different than the story that that you've seen in the news or what you've heard about on social media.
Yeah. And I think that, this moment that we're in now is so different than the moment we were in, 5 years ago. And so I think that in this moment, I also think about, how do we, as people who are looking to raise money, how do we think about being okay with growing slow? What does it look like for us to grow our businesses slow?
Yes.
Which I know that, this economy often rewards those who are aggressive, and those who are aggressive make certain sacrifices in order to do that, to move at speed. But then, I'm go back to my business partner again. One thing she tells me, every now and then she has said to me, well, Kimberly, let's not forget, wicked money moves fast. So if you don't want wicked money, sometimes that means you're going to have to go slow.
Yeah. That is so true. I think we have this kind of it's now or never mentality that I think a lot of people have, because there's a lot of conventional business knowledge tells you things like, if you're not growing, you're dying. If you're not, or if you're not scaling, that you're dying. And it's like slow growth also is a path to success, but nobody talks about that because it's not sexy. It's not fun.
It's not sexy. And I think that, but I'll tell you what is sexy: having time to breathe, not having to answer to people who want you to compromise your values for the sake of compromise, sake of like appeasing them. What's sexy when you can actually, recognize that you're not over leveraged and that you're not scrambling because you're in over your head in debt. And I think that those are the kinds of freedoms that I find very attractive. And I also think that, it's so important that we recognize that so many of the models that we inherit about business are either myths promoted to, to make us feel like we can win, when they're really just they're dreams that are not necessarily systemically accessible to us. So, it's like tasting a pipe dream. When it becomes like, and this goes back to a different question, Rachel, was like, what are we really trying to get our businesses to do? What's the function of the businesses that we're designing? And sometimes that's the business design in of itself is an act of activism. It's not that the win isn't that you
Yes.
built $1 billion brand. The win is that you built something that was a part of a longer continuum of revolutionary thinking about what's possible. Can we be satisfied with that?
Yes.
Does the legacy have to be money and
Well,
millions?
that goes back to your point that we need to be satisfied with that. We have to understand that context, because I think that is missing history in a lot of American education, that we have this entire, so we learned about the civil rights movement, and then to a lesser extent, we learn about the labor movement. But I think it is intentional that we do not teach about the labor movement, because we don't want to inform people about how the rights that they have in the workplace came about, and give them any ideas that they may need to start mobilizing in similar ways now. But we very rarely talk about the intersection of those two movements and how neither of them would have been successful without the other. And that we are, I consider myself to be operating on the shoulders of the giants that push those movements forward, that is part of the legacy of what we are building. But a lot of people are missing that context and don't realize that they're continuing that work. And I think that also gives you some strength when times are difficult, to know that this is a continuation of work and not just something that you are out here floating all alone doing on your own.
That's right. And that's why I think it's so important for us in this community to know who our heroes are, and I think that means we have to discover new heroes, and that the ones that we're often taught to celebrate are not, they represent such a small percent of what pioneering has looked like in this tradition. So, I want to encourage everyone who's listening, read James Baldwin, read Bell Hooks, read, David Whyte, this Irish philosopher, poet that I love. Read about movements in revolution and movements in organizing, because that's what we don't have a whole lot of depth in being able to do. And it's made us ill-equipped to actually lead. And, as another way of thinking about how do we do this, we have to lean into where people have done that, where that work exists already. So if you are listening and you're looking for something, I encourage you to go to builditboldly.com, get a copy of the leader's work. It's a blueprint for how to think about these things. And I really have been so intentional in that work of just like pulling out all of these voices and this longer wisdom that people have to discover, that we got to discover.
Yes. Now, speaking of Build It Boldly, your tagline is find your purpose, craft your vision, build it boldly. Talk to us about what that means and what you are doing with this new body of work.
That tagline, about craft and about vision is really about helping to inspire other entrepreneurs to be ever more intentional about what it is that they're actually seeking to produce, and examining their motives. Know what your vision is, but know the why, so you can know your ask, right? Your vision enables you to know your ask of your employees, your potential hires, your business partners, your sponsors, your funders. You have to know, you have to craft that, right? That means you have to really think about how you're going to look at other models. What pieces of other models you're going to bring in. The vision is in of itself a design practice. So you got to craft that as an act of design. And then you're going to really think about what is it that you're building, and for whom, and why? Because that's the thing that's going to keep you going when the money is tight, or when that you get told no, or you get told not now. You have to really understand your why. So Build It Boldly is a guideline where it's like, it's 70% the how we really craft a vision, and 30% why I did it the way I did it. And I made that choice, Rachel, because as a teacher, you're always trying to get people to go with you to a place that they don't know. That's learning. Learning is leaving the place that you have comfort to go into the unknown. And you need to feel like you know who you're traveling with. So the first 30% of Build It Boldly is this is vulnerably, these are the mountains I've had to climb. And I don't know what your mountains are, but this has been some of my mountains. And now that I've climbed those mountains, here's how I crafted a vision. Here's how I built it boldly. And the new body of work is about teaching. It's about making that easy for people, accessible.
Mm-hmm. And I love everything about that because we need more of that in this world. And as we are wrapping up, one thing I wanted to ask you is that if we ran this conversation back 10 years from now, what do you want to be true that isn't true today?
About the world, about me, about what?
Take your pick. It could be
Ooh,
any
okay.
area, but just what is the change that you kind of most want to see?
I hope that America, as an experiment, a bold experiment in government, I hope that Americans are able to love this country enough to want to really push it into its most radical potential, which is a place that is a beacon of possibility for the world, of a people who decided that they wanted to
Yes.
really make democracy something that was accessible to everyone, and that they wanted to leverage that collective power to protect the planet and to model resistance and revolution in a way that is nonviolent.
Yes. And on that note, I'm not going to ask any more questions because I want those gems to just sit with people. The vision for America to become the most radical realization of the dream that we could aspire to. Yeah. And on that note, I want to thank you, Dr. Kimberly McGlonn, for the depth, the honesty, and the call to build with imagination. And for our listeners, Kimberly's book, Build It Boldly: How Daring Business Leaders Can Gain Influence and Create Impact, is really a field guide for everything that we just talked about. And you can find it wherever you buy books. And we're going to have it linked in some links to purchase the book and to Build It Boldly, because we didn't even talk about there's a Build It Boldly community and an entire body of work that Dr. Kimberly is working on. So if this episode lit up something in you, share it with a founder who's ready to stop building small. Until next time. As always, if this conversation resonated with you, here's what you can do. Subscribe to The Purpose Profit Shift wherever you listen to podcasts. We've got episodes dropping regularly with more visionary founders and changemakers who are reshaping how business gets done. And if you found value in today's episode, leave us a rating and review. It helps other values-driven leaders find us. Until next time, keep leading with intention, scaling responsibly, and building businesses that matter. I'm Rachel Bernier Green, and this is The Purpose Profit Shift.